What the Bible actually says about heaven and the afterlife will blow your mind because it is so different than what most people think it is. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. This is one of those videos that could be an hour, but I'm not going to let it be an hour. We're going to keep it short, but I'm going to talk fast and we're going to go quickly. So you might want to take notes or watch it again. So for most of the Old Testament, there is absolutely nothing like heaven, the way we think of it, the streets of gold, the reward for the righteous when they die. Instead, it is a place called Sheol. Now, Sheol is the deep. It is the realm of the dead. You see Sheol referenced at the very beginning of the Bible. So it's present from the very beginning. It says, and darkness was over the face of the deep. The deep is Sheol. And that's where all of the souls go when they die. And that is not where God dwells because, again, in that creation story in Genesis chapter 1, there's this firmament created, a clear glass dome, and above that is water, and that's where the sun and the moon lives. And then in other verses, you get this idea of above that is the dwelling place of God. And you will hear verses talk about God's dwelling place in the heavens. And in the heavens is that idea of, there's actually three heavens. There's the sky, there's the water and the place where the sun and the moon is. And then there is the third heaven. We'll get to that later again. And that's where God's dwelling place is. And that's not where people go. People don't go up in most of the Old Testament, they go down. And that place, Sheol, the realm of the dead, you find that in like the book of Psalms, where it says in 89:48, what man can live and never see death? What man can rescue his soul from Sheol, right? That's where it goes afterwards. And there's a lot of references. You can find them in Job and Ecclesiastes, like all kinds of places, because that was the way people understood in that part of the world. There was this realm of the dead, and that's where everybody went. And it wasn't just Jewish people that believed that way. Lots of religions, kind of the common theme during that time in that area. But the place where you start to see some sort of afterlife, paradise, imagery, idea, actually is in a time period that is often referred to as the intertestamental period. That's the period of time between the Old and the New Testaments where a lot of the apocryphal books come. So you find this in Enoch and in Maccabees, but basically those ideas are happening at a really interesting time. It is when the Jewish people are being intensely persecuted. They lose control over the temple, then they get it back. And during those times, throughout history, the idea of a divine and afterlife reward for the righteous and punishment for the unrighteous becomes a really important way that people cope with that period of time. And so it's not surprising that it's during that period of time when those ideas start to come up. And then you get to Jesus, who is more complicated, well, because Jesus. And Jesus talks about heaven in some interesting ways. You know, one verse that's often used to talk about heaven is John 14:2-3, where it says, Jesus says, my Father's house has many rooms, and I go there to prepare a place for you. That's actually not talking about heaven. It's a way, it's an idiom to talk about marriage. And this is Jesus talking about bringing people into God's family in this sort of beautiful way. But Jesus does sometimes talk about heaven as this like paradise, this afterlife. In Luke 23, when he's on the cross, he says to one of the thieves, today you will be with me in paradise, right? And so there's a sense of when Jesus is talking that sometimes he's talking about something that's happening after this life, and that is a time of being with Jesus and God in a more immediate way. But Jesus also will talk about the kingdom of heaven. And when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, he is not talking about stuff that's happening in some sort of other dimension. When he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, he's talking about stuff that's happening here on earth. And so there's this like dualistic idea. There's just like two sides of the coin, that there is heaven, but there is heaven that needs to happen here, but then there's also this paradise, which ends up leading to some interesting ideas that people have later. Then we have Paul. Paul is interesting because you have him echoing this sort of older idea that we find at the very beginning of the Old Testament, but also is a popular idea at that time. This idea in 2 Corinthians 12, where he talks about being caught up into the third heaven. And remember, we talked about that. There's the sky is the first heaven. There's a hard dome. Then there is water and the sun and the moon. That's the second heaven. And then there's the third heaven above that where God dwells. And Paul gets to go there. And he acts as if like that's an unusual thing. And then there is 1 Thessalonians. So in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul talks about the return of Jesus, not the rapture. That thing was made up. But the second coming of Jesus, Jesus appears in the sky, and all of the Christians sort of resurrect or are caught up into that moment with him and go and meet Jesus in the sky. This is puts Jesus as like the heavens are his realm or his dwelling place. But it has this idea of the resurrection of the dead, and that the dead are not already with Jesus. The dead resurrect and come up and join Jesus. And the theology around the resurrection of the dead is a fascinating subject that we don't have time to talk about right now. Then you have the book of Revelation, which is problematic on all kinds of different levels, but we won't go into that. There's other videos that I've done about that. The book of Revelation, though, ends with this idea of heaven coming down to earth, and that the dwelling place of God, the place where God is sort of reigning, merges with the earth. And now God's kingdom is fully here on the earth as it was in heaven. So for a long time, the idea was that, yes, believers would go and be with Jesus in heaven, but that was not the eternal thing, that eventually it would all merge back together and people would be back here on earth. And it was the resurrection that was sort of the ultimate hope. Then later in sort of the medieval times, it begins to be, no, it's very literal. It happens right after you die, and that is your eternal dwelling place. And it's transitioned from that. And now there are people who still have that medieval understanding of it, but a lot of scholars, most scholars will talk about it way more in terms of metaphor, that there aren't houses, there aren't streets of gold, but this is a metaphor for an existence after this one where you get to spend time and be in the presence of God. And that can happen in all kinds of different ways. N.T. Wright, though, is really focused on this idea that none of that is important. The ultimate importance is the resurrection of the dead. It's a really great book called Surprised by Hope that you can read to get more information about that. So surprise, the Bible doesn't say really one thing about heaven. It's not univocal. It's actually never univocal. But the Bible is sort of all over the place in a lot of ways. But the other thing that's really important to note is that the Bible doesn't actually say a lot at all. The focus on the afterlife is very, very tiny. And it's an aside, it's an allusion, it's a little phrase here and there, like you'll be with me today in paradise. And that gets to what this rabbi said to someone that I know, that when they asked the rabbi, what about the afterlife? What do Jews believe about the afterlife? And the rabbi said, well, Jews believe that if we should spend all this time talking about it and thinking about it, that God probably would have said more about it. Instead, focus on the here and the now and on making earth look more like heaven.